Hi there. I'm going to talk about something a little bit difficult today. It's one of the reasons that I became a psychotherapist, actually, and that is suicide. Um, I lost my son to suicide when he was 16 years old, which unbelievably is now just about 16 years in the past, which means he has been gone almost as long as he was alive. It's hard to imagine. Um, the other reason is my own struggles with mental health. I was profoundly depressed in my teens and also again in my 20s, and had my fair share of suicidal ideation as well. So it's something that's really important to me, and advocating on behalf of people struggling with suicidal ideation is important to me, as is finding better ways to help them and connect with them. So the thing I specifically want to address today is the difference between fantasizing about suicide and having a plan to complete suicide. These are two very different things. They are absolutely related, but they are not the same thing. The first, fantasizing about suicide, starts with sort of the idea of, I wish I could just be dead. I wish I wasn't alive. I wish I was dead. That kind of thing. We've all had those thoughts. I think we've all had those thoughts. Maybe I'm delusional, but I'm pretty sure we've all at some point wished we could just be dead, because living is hard. It is hard, and sometimes it feels too hard. And in those moments, we may think to ourselves, this is just too much. Like, why even bother, right? So that would be sort of the lowest end of the spectrum of suicidal thinking. And then it can amp up from there. You can become more and more depressed and think more and more about suicide, imagining what it might be like, imagining what your plan might be. And all of that, until you get to a point where you feel like you have no choice but to take your life, all of that falls in the first category. And the way we can figure out if it's in the first category is because as remote as the choice might seem, as much as we may wish to die, we still somewhere in our minds perceive that we do have a choice, right? So that's suicidal fantasizing. As soon as we turn the corner and get into a state of mind where we no longer perceive that we have a choice, that is suicide with intent to act, and that is incredibly dangerous, because people in that state of mind are in so much pain. They literally do not believe they have any choice but to take their life. So I like to give people the analogy of what happened the day the World Trade Center went down. We were watching the TV in horror as people were jumping and leaping from these windows that were hundreds of stories up, leaping to their deaths. And they had to know they were going to die. There was no way to not know that. And you wondered, how could these people do that? How could they jump out of a window like that knowing they're going to die? Well, the answer is that what was behind them was even more frightening than death. And that is exactly what happens in the mind of someone who's gotten to a place where they know they have to die. Now, one of the reasons I think it's so important to differentiate these states of mind is because it impacts how we respond to somebody who's talking about suicide or thinking about suicide. So say we have a person like a teenager whose boyfriend just broke up with her, and she's devastated. And she tells her best friend, I want to kill myself. The best friend tells her mom, and her mom tells the mom of the girl. So the mom of the girl goes into a room, and she's been taught that any mention of suicide should be taken totally seriously. Correctly, she's been taught that. But by seriously, she has been told, you take that kid to the emergency room right now. If she's talking about suicide, take her to the emergency room right now. The problem with that is if you don't gauge the level of intent of the person talking about suicide, you could end up further isolating them and shutting them down. And here's why. So let's say you take that teenager to the ER and everyone's just on her. She's being, you know, questioned and poked and prodded and scared. And, you know, it's this huge drama. And what that does is it makes her withdraw into herself, right? And it's humiliating. It can be traumatizing. It can be a lot of things. None of them good. None of them, you know, positive. So, okay, so the teen gets through this crisis somehow, whatever, goes home from the ER and thinks to herself, I will never, ever share with anybody ever again that I'm thinking about taking my life. So the next time she thinks about it, instead of reaching out, she isolates herself, which is the number one most dangerous thing a suicidal person can do, isolate themselves. Now, just because she wasn't in that suicidal state of mind to begin with, the intent to act, she can now move into that. And because she has no counter voice to the voice in her head, that voice can amp up and get louder and louder and more serious. And it has the possibility, a much greater possibility, when she's just by herself thinking and her depression or her anxiety is lying to her and telling her she should die. There's a much greater possibility that she will escalate and get to the point where she could actually take her life. Terrible outcome, terrible. So one of the things that you can, as the person, you know, who loves a person who might be suicidal, one of the things that you can try to do always is to try and connect with them in any way. Even if it's just sitting in a room with them physically and refusing to leave, that's a good choice. But you can try to engage them in some kind of dialogue and determine if they have a plan, right? If they have a concrete plan. If they do, you should be worried. Because once somebody gets from fantasizing about suicide to knowing they're going to complete suicide, that is one of the things that changes. They have been probably working out a concrete plan in their mind for quite some time. And if you get any inkling that that is the case, that's a good time to respond with all the bells and whistles, okay? So the important thing for those of us who are survivors of a loved one's suicide, the important thing for all of us to remember is we can help. We can have an impact. At any point along our loved one's suicidal thinking, we can have an impact and we can change the course of what is happening. And we can better have an impact if we try to understand where along the spectrum their thinking is. Now, along with having a plan, one of the hallmarks of someone who is hell-bent on jumping from that World Trade Center window, one of the hallmarks of that is that they will communicate, hopefully they'll communicate, definitely in their own mind they're saying, that there is no other choice. They must die. And it's that inability to perceive any other options that is the single most deadly mindset to have as a person struggling with mental illness. For that person, if you are lucky enough to find them in that state of mind, that's the person to take to the ER. That's the person who might need to be physically restrained. That's the person who might need to be under professional observation for a day or longer, or even to be committed in order to save their lives long enough that the voices, the lying voices of their mental illness can recede and options can once again be perceived. So that was what I wanted to talk about today. The difference between, the whole spectrum of suicidal thinking, starting with the pretty common, I wish I was dead, to the very dangerous, I have a plan and I have no choice but to die. And trying to understand the differences there so we can better help people who might be in those states of mind. I will be talking about this again, lots and lots, because as I said, it's a subject that is extremely important to me, and raising awareness about suicide prevention and surviving the suicide of a loved one is one of my very top priorities as a mental health professional. Before I go today, I did want to add one thing, and I'm probably going to say this every time I talk about suicide. I have a real problem with the phrase, someone or other committed suicide. It's a really old phrase, and to me, it smacks of criminality. People commit crimes. Suicide is not a crime, despite what some religions may have you believe. Is the act of a desperate, mentally ill person who feels that they've run out of options. Suicide is not a crime. It is certainly not a vengeful act. It is not a selfish act. It is not a cruel act, except towards the person who wants to take their own life. Actually, maybe not even then, because in a sense, they're trying to take care of themselves in the only way that they know how. Suicide is not about trying to hurt other people, and therefore to call it committing suicide feels profoundly inappropriate to me. So I advocate for using the phrase taking one's life instead. And my grief counselor many years ago chose the phrase completing suicide, which I think is also much more appropriate and humane, both for those who have taken their lives and for those who are left behind. So let's get rid of that phrase, committed suicide. Let's learn how to better interact with people who are in some kind of suicidal state of mind, whatever level it may be. And let's continue this conversation as well. You can reach out to me at my website, PsycheFinder.com, and I would love to hear from you. If you disagree with what I've said here today, great, bring it on. I love dialogue, and I just love to hear from you no matter what it is you'd like to say. So I will see you again tomorrow, and thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your time.